Now, once we understand that money is what we use to buy goods and services, and our root definition of the money supply, M1, is currency in circulation and checking account deposits, we can see how banks can create money out of nowhere just by doing the type of business that banks do. So where does money come from? How do banks do this? This is going to be like magic. Well, first, let's look at a bank's balance sheet. Balance sheet is the way a bank keeps track of its sources of funds and its uses of funds. There's liabilities. Liabilities for a bank are the sources of its funds. When you deposit money in a bank, your deposit is owed to you. So it's an asset for you. But for a bank, it's a liability. Those are the sources of a bank's funds, either deposits or owner's equity. Right? Now, assets are the uses of the funds. This is what is owed to a bank. So a bank either uses its funds, we're going to look at a simplified bank, where it either makes loans or it holds reserves. It keeps money either in its vault or at what we'll find out as the Federal Reserve as reserves. So let's see how this balance sheet is. Suppose we have a fictitious bank, right, and it's got liabilities, which include $2,000 in deposits and $200 in owner's equity. That's money put in by the owners. Now, what happens to those $2,000? The bank could make, since it has $2,200 in liabilities, $2,000 in loans and $200 in reserves. So these loans are what goes out to businesses or individuals, and those are assets to the bank. The $200 in reserves are what are held by the bank in case people come to try to withdraw their deposits. And so this is how a bank's balance sheet works. Now, in this hypothetical example, this bank is holding 10% of its deposits as required reserves. Okay, so let's assume that that 10% holds true, and let's see what happens when a deposit is made. First, let's talk about what these reserves are. The reserves are the portion of the bank's deposits set aside in case people want to come and withdraw their money. Some of it is required. Required by law, banks are required to hold a certain percentage of their deposits as reserves, and that percentage changes by the Federal Reserve as a policy tool. And so those are going to be called required reserves. Banks also hold excess reserves because they don't want to be right at their limit at all times. Just like you might hold more money in your bank than zero because you don't want to overdraft your checking account. Right? So there are excess reserves, required reserves. Those add up to be total reserve. So let's look at this bank. Suppose the required reserve ratio were 10%, and somebody made a deposit of $1,000 in the bank. And so what has happened? We've taken $1,000 in currency and deposited in the bank, and we've got $1,000 of new deposits. What does that do to the money supply? Well, let's see. We know that the money supply, we're going to simplify it, is equal to currency plus deposits. So what has happened here? Well, we've had a deposit of currency, so it's no longer in circulation. So that's going to come out to be negative $1,000 change in currency, but we had an additional $1,000 in deposits. So what happened to the money supply? Nothing. Right? But what does the bank do with that $1,000 in deposits? Well, it's going to hold $100 as reserves, and then it makes $900 worth of loans, because this is how banks earn income. They accept deposits, and they pay some level of interest, and then they make loans, probably at a higher level of interest. This is how banks earn income. What happens to that $900? Well, it either gets spent on something or it gets immediately deposited in a bank. When it gets spent on something, whoever sold it deposits that in a bank. So that becomes a new deposit, probably at a different bank. So what has happened now? Now we've seen another increase in deposits of $900. And then what happens to that $900? Well, $90 gets saved as reserves, and $810 gets loaned out and becomes more deposits. So we can add in another 810, and so on and so forth until we need to add it all up. And so what we see is the simple deposit of currency in a bank creates new money because banks loan out some fraction of that deposit. The overall change in the money supply, we can add that up by looking at the money multiplier. The money multiplier is going to be equal to 1 over the reserve ratio. So the total increase in checking account balance throughout all banks is equal to the initial cash deposit times 1 over the reserve ratio. The total change in the money supply is slightly different. So the total change in the money supply is going to be equal to the change in currency plus the change in deposits. And so in the example we had before, we had a reduction of currency of 1,000. We had an increase in deposits equal to the initial deposit times 1 over 0.1, the reserve ratio. And that's going to be equal to $9,000. So the overall increase in the money supply is $9,000 just because we took $1,000 in currency and deposited it in the bank. It's like magic. That's how banks create money, just by doing business. The banks can also destroy money. The money multiplier works in reverse. If you withdraw currency from a bank, then all of this goes in the opposite direction. Deposits go down by 1,000, currency goes up by 1,000, and the overall money supply would shrink by 9,000 given this money multiplier.